Hey guys, with the start of the new quarter, we're going to be jumping into the Civil War and Reconstruction. So we got a lot going on for the next 9 weeks of the school year. And so we're going to go ahead and jump straight into it. Now, before we can get into the Civil War, we need to understand what essentially caused this conflict between the northern states and these southern states. Now, we all know slavery is the big issue that we have here, but there's a lot more to it than just the act of slavery. And that's what we're going to look at over the next couple weeks. And we're going to start with this idea of how we were a nation of differences. So you had three regions, three sections. You oftentimes hear me use the word sectionalism here, and it's referring to the three sections of the country. You had the North, the South, which were the main two sections that we're going to be talking about, and then the West, which is all that new territory that we learned about in the third quarter. From California to Texas, Louisiana Purchase to Mexican secession. Kind of all this new land that we gained. And the North and the South really came in conflict because they were trying to spread their own ideologies west. And that's where this split really takes place. Let's start looking at that. It all starts really with the introduction of slavery into the United States. Slaves were first introduced in the United States in 1619 to the colony of Jamestown. They were brought over by an English merchant ship who had stolen several slaves off of a Portuguese slave ship, and they brought them to that first colony of the New World. But slaves were actually being brought to the New World before the first U.S. colony, starting in 1523, extending to 1832. Over 12 million slaves would be brought to the New World. Now, of those 12 million slaves being brought to the New World, only about 388,000 of them were brought to the U.S. specifically. The rest were brought to the Caribbeans, Brazil, South America, Central America. But a very small chunk of that 12 million were brought to the United States. But the process of how these slaves got to the United States is what we call the triangular slave trade. And the way this would work is that it would start here in Europe. Now, Europe was industrialized. It was the powerhouse of the world at the time. And they would make these manufactured goods like boats, guns, carriages, like anything that was a finalized finished product. And they'd send these manufactured goods to Africa. And in exchange for these manufactured goods, Africa, the elites in Africa, would essentially enslave the lower classes of Africans, and they'd sell them to these European merchants. These European merchants would then take these enslaved Africans, bring them to the New World, where they would sell them to people in the New World. In exchange, these merchants would gather raw materials like sugar, cotton, tobacco, and indigo, lumber, and timber, anything like that, and they'd bring those raw materials back to Europe to then be produced into a manufactured goods. It sounds a lot like that term mercantilism we learned about in quarter one, and the process would repeat itself. And this is kind of the typical slave trade process during the early times. However, by 1811, the US and the UK outlawed this slave trade. They did not outlaw slavery in their countries, but they outlawed the trading of slaves across the Atlantic Ocean, and they attempted to enforce this. But the United States won't actually outlaw slavery until 1865. But this is kind of how slaves first got brought to the United States. But how did they create separation or sectionalism in the country? Well, it all starts with how the North and the South were so different from each other. The North was an industrialized section of the United States, relying on the Industrial Revolution that we learned about in the third quarter. Factories, steam power, large cities with working populations, whereas the South was primarily farms, or what we're going to refer to them as plantations, where they would grow their crops, cotton, tobacco, and indigo, and then sell them to the North or sell them to Europe to then be manufactured into a finished product. The North, in reality, then, was actually reliant on slaves, even though they technically outlawed slavery in 1804 in the North, but they relied on the slaves of the South to provide the raw materials. Well, in the North, you also had these large populations of people living in small spaces. That's why you have the cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia that you have today, really caused by this Industrial Revolution. Whereas in the South, it was small population, large spaces. Sometimes your nearest neighbor would be over a mile away because you'd own such a large portion of land to grow your raw materials on. The North also included wage labor. We learned about the terrible conditions of the Industrial Revolution for factory workers in third quarter, But they did make at least some money. And that little bit of money they made, they could spend it how they wanted to. They got to choose how to spend it. Well, the South was slave labor. They relied on, the grueling backbreaking labor of slaves in the South, and they didn't receive any money. And plantation owners would say they did receive compensation through housing, clothing, and food, but they never received cash money like they did in the North. In the North, they also had freedom for slaves. By 1804, again, slavery had been outlawed in the North. But slaves were not considered equal. They were still considered as inferior or less than their, and I'm just going to say it, white counterparts. But they did have freedom. They just couldn't vote. They couldn't own property. They couldn't use the court systems. They just were not seen as equal. In the South, however, slaves were dependent on for cash crops, tobacco, cotton, indigo, to grow, farm, pick, all of those raw materials. And so you start to see just in the path that the North and the South are taking in, their social aspect, there's a lot of differences. And it starts that idea of sectionalism, this splitting between the North and the South. But there were some other events that contribute to this. And the first one being what we call the Second Great Awakening. Now, we learned about the First Great Awakening in quarter one, where they questioned religion and traditions and the power of the king that helped spur our independence. But in the early and mid 1800s, we had a Second Great Awakening. And in the Second Great Awakening, we started questioning the traditions of the country. So those traditions could be who had the power or the right to vote. If you remember, it was only white men who owned property that could vote. Well, we changed that with Andrew Jackson and the democratic expansion, the common man idea, where all white men could vote, right? And we also questioned the traditions of the role of women. Were women really intended to be housewives, or should they be considered equals to men? And they started to question all these practices. And one of those main practices that they questioned was the issue of slavery. And one of the big proponents of ending slavery, or supporters of ending slavery, was Charles Finney. And in 1826, Charles Finney started what he called these revivals, which, if we look at the picture on the back, essentially is a festival. And at these festivals, they'd have speakers such as Charles himself, who would attempt to, as he said, wake the common person, right? To get them aware of and to, change the traditions and the practices going on in the country at the time. And a lot of these things that they discussed and he tried to encourage change in were things like improvement in education. Horace Mann will be an involvement in this, who creates the idea of public education for children, but improved education for Americans, and not just white Americans in this case. We're going to see him push for African Americans and any minority groups to receive equal education as well. You're going to have a push of the temperance movement, which is going to want to end the consumption of alcohol. Women especially, or wives especially, pushed for this idea because they were the victims of a lot of abusive husbands who would come, home drunk and then, abuse their wives and their children. And also the morality of slavery, of this idea that we should end slavery in the country. And Charles Finney once said, all sort of abandoned characters are awakened and converted. The worst part of human is softened and made to appear lovely. And this idea that at these revivals, we would abandon our old traditions and our old characteristics, would become awakened and converted to the new ideas, and that we'd become better people because of it. And so we start to see the North really grasps this idea, while the South wants to hold on to its traditions, especially the tradition of slavery, as the two sections begin to further divide. But we also had another movement in the country called the abolitionist movement. And in this abolitionist movement, as we see in red at the top, they wanted to put an end to something. And in this case, they wanted to put an end to slavery. As I already mentioned, by 1804, slavery was abolished in the northern states, those states above the Ohio River. But southern states still practiced this institute. Well, by the mid-1800s, this abolitionist movement had a very large following, and they wanted to, and they pushed for the government to abolish and end slavery in the country. And some of the famous individuals who supported this were William Lloyd Garrison, who used his own newspaper to spread the word of slavery and how it should be abolished in the country. You had Frederick Douglass, who was a former slave, a public speaker, a political advisor to Abraham Lincoln, who would give speeches and arguing how African Americans were poorly treated and how they should be considered equals to the rest of the population. He even said one time in his speech, he says, "I appear this evening as a thief and a robber. I stole this head, these limbs, this body from my master, and I ran off with them." Referring to this idea that he has a head, he has arms, he has limbs, he can think for himself, but somehow he's a thief because he ran away from his master and stole himself away from his master. It doesn't make any sense. How could a person who can act on their own accord and have their own appendages be robbing a person of themselves, right? I mean, it was preposterous to the country. John Quincy Adams was also an abolitionist. He was the first president in the 1820s to support and propose an amendment ending slavery in the country. Well, as you can expect, this caused outrage throughout the North and the South, specifically in the South, because they thought that he was going to attack and end the issue of slavery or end slavery in the country. Northerners supported it, and you start to see just by this proposal, which was shot down immediately. But a proposal to end slavery splits the country even further. You then also had resistance to slavery, seen in the Underground Railroad. This was a network that helped slaves escape the South to go places to like the northern states, to Canada, to Mexico, to places where slavery was abolished. And one of those famous abolitionists who helped with this was Harriet Tubman, who herself had escaped slavery several times. She was a conductor on the railroad, which meant that she would help slaves escape north. You'll notice a lot of the terminology they use here is that similar to a railroad, a conductor, stations. You're going to have rail lines, which refer to the roads, but it was intended to be secret talk to make people think they were actually on a railroad, but really it was just a secret passage of trails that they would walk and ride horses on. Another contributing factor to this sectionalism was women's rights movement. And women's suffrage dates clear back to the early parts of the country with Abigail Adams, where she argues that the country should not forget women and include women in the voting process, which did not happen, as we know. But in the mid-1800s, women were still trying to fight for these rights, this equality. Now, suffrage is the right to vote. It does not mean that they're suffering. It means that they have the right to vote. And in 1848, they hold a convention at the Seneca Falls, New York, led by two women named Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And at this meeting, there's about 300 women there, they start this argument that women have been, treated unjustly for centuries, that they had their rights taken away, that they are seen as inferior, and that they should be considered equal to men. Elizabeth, even in her speech, said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men and women are created equal," referring, of course, to the famous line of the Declaration of Independence. This, however, had kind of a secondary effect. A lot of people started to say, if women should have the right to this idea of equality, then so should slaves, especially men slaves or male slaves. And so we start to see the North again making this argument that slaves should be seen as equal. Maybe not equal, but should be seen as free. And the South, again, becomes very resistant to this, saying, no, they're not men, they're not people. They are property because I purchased them. As terrible as that sounds, but they are property. But you start to see, again, the North and the South further dividing. And then finally, a book was written. And this book, as simple as it might sound, had one of the greatest effects on the North truly saying, hey, it is time for us to end slavery. And that book is called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, it was written in 1852 by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet was the daughter of a preacher, an abolitionist from the North. And so she'd been taught these ideas that slavery is a sin, slavery should not be allowed in the country. And she wrote a story called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And in this story, it's about the life of a man named Uncle Tom, who was an enslaved African American, and his children and his wife. And the big idea of the story is that he, as a slave, was constantly abused by his owner. He was whipped, he was starved, he was, put out to work in conditions that were grueling, unacceptable, and then he never received any sort of compensation. And this opened a lot of people's eyes to the inhumanity of slavery, how the Southern plantation owners, the slave owners, were truly treating their slaves. Well, Southerners naturally called it propaganda. saying that this is all false claims, that this is just a push to end slavery, that we in fact treat our slaves as humane as we can, that they have housing, they have clothing, that they don't get beaten, that this is all essentially a lie. But the nail had already been struck. The United States started to realize that slavery was an inhumane action. And pretty soon, as we continued this movement west, it got called into question more and more and more, and it eventually divides the nation between the North and the South. And we'll see more of that in the coming weeks.